A little more? Now? Excellent. Just so you know, the bathroom's right behind me, so if you feel the need to go, we don't mind at all. So, yeah, feel free to, not do the rain dance and use the bathroom. Well, welcome everybody to the ethics of working with social media companies. My name is Yasser Khan. Until recently, I was the head of digital video, social, and podcasts at Al Jazeera English. Just a little bit about myself. I was hired by Al Jazeera a while ago to make documentary films. And then one day I realized I hadn't turned on my television in 4 years, and I was watching everything on my phone or on my laptop. And I realized I better learn this or else I'm going to be toast. So I switched over to digital, and in those days, and by those days I mean literally 2013, if you went over to digital, you had screwed up somehow. And so people would stop me in the hallways and say, "What did you do?" To which I'd reply, "No, I asked for this." And then you'd hear, "Well, you know, digital is the future." And you'd say, "No, no, no, we're late. We've been checking emails since the early 90s. And so I'd said to my bosses that anybody who says digital is the future needs to be fired. So, you know, and when I got into AJE Digital, it was a lot of old newspaper folks doing articles and curating images, and there was no video unit to speak of. So first myself, and then Ziad, who will introduce himself in a bit, we basically built the video operations for AJE Digital from the ground up. As luck would have it, we both left Al Jazeera at the same time. But I'm going to, enough about me, I'm going to start with Ryan at the end, who will introduce himself, and then we'll take it from there.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ryan Kellett. I'm the Director of Audience at The Washington Post. It's lovely to be here with all of you and all of the panelists today. A little bit about why I am here. On the panel today, I think I am going to represent, even if I may have to play devil's advocate occasionally in a spirited discussion. But I will represent, for the most part, the publisher point of view. So, the media company, those working in the newsroom. And I definitely want to speak to, what does the average reporter and editor really need to know about sort of data collection, about the role of social media companies as part of their own operation? Because I work with a newsroom of about 900 journalists with a wide knowledge of social media. And so that includes personal social media, but that also includes what we need to do our jobs. Because social media is not only just a personal thing, it's part of the distribution, it's part of reporting. So this morning in this very room, I was at the ethics of social verification, which is a very different angle on the same topic. And so I'm more than happy to talk about all those different kind of aspects. In the newsroom, I'm the main liaison for, and one of many liaisons, I would argue, with various social media companies, whether that's Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Reddit, a variety of different social media companies. And I think it's important to have an editorial lead as part of that. And it's not just a business side, a person sort of handling that relationship, because I think there are ways to work together. By no means am I saying, Facebook is great or Twitter is wonderful as companies, but I do think they are strategic partners in a variety of different circumstances, and would be happy to talk more about that as we go along.
Hi everyone, my name is Dina Rickman, and I suppose I can also represent a bit of publisher experience. I've just left my job at The Independent, which is a British newspaper, after 4 years. 2 of those were as head of social. And in that time, I, again, worked with sort of Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, all the kind of social media companies, also kind of strategic partnerships as well with Google. And I suppose the point that I'm here and the thing that I really want to talk about is about how ethics isn't the kind of conversation that you'll have sort of on a panel in 2018, but it's something that you kind of constantly have to be thinking about, because as anyone who works in social will know, the situation is the most changeable. So for anyone in the newsroom, I think the people who work in social and probably SEO as well are the ones who are getting used to the most change, and it's a kind of renewed conversation and a renewed contract that you have to have with your readers, and you have to very much stay on top of it. So yeah, I've just made the main point that I was going to make on the panel right at the beginning. and yeah, I'll hand over to Ziad.
Sure.
You can leave now.
Yeah. Bye.
So my name is Ziad Ramli. I was the social media lead at Al Jazeera English, and I worked very closely with Yasser. And my job was basically to work on social strategy and manage our relationships with these platforms. And since leaving the company in August, I've had time to reflect on my role and myself in the broader industry. And I've thought a lot about how our interactions with these platforms impact their own internal policy. So as someone responsible for growth, I might say something to a partner manager at Facebook. I might say, I would really love to know what kind of interests our readers have. You have all that data on Facebook. Is there any way we can get that from you? Or I'd really love to know deeper demographics and reading habits. And it's only after I left that I thought, okay, Facebook is developing all of these kind of products to infringe on our privacy, and a lot of it is because we as journalists are asking for them. So I thought it's quite rich for us to be reporting on them very critically and completely absolving ourselves of any blame. And if we believe that privacy is a human right, which I do, we have a responsibility to be defending our readers' privacy as well. So yeah, that's my position.
There you go. Hi, my name is Jillian York. I've got a couple different hats on here, I guess, having also worked a little bit with these guys with Al Jazeera. But also, I'm the Director for International Freedom of Expression, such a hard title, at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a digital rights advocacy organization based in the US. And so most of my experience working with companies is on a kind of different realm. I do a lot of work with them in terms of trying to restore content that's been erroneously taken down, wrongfully taken down. I work with them on advising them around issues of privacy and free expression. And so I think that this is I absolutely agree with what Dina said, that this is an ongoing question. But I also think that it's almost a moot point in the sense that working with them is hardly a choice at this point for journalists. And so a lot of the groups that I've worked with, and where my kind of struggle comes in here, is I've worked with a lot of small media organizations who've been pushed off these platforms, had their content censored by these platforms, and who lack the kind of privilege that big newsrooms have to be able to partner with these platforms. And so I think that that's kind of one of the more interesting angles that I'd like to talk about a bit more. I won't get into it too much now because I know we're on a time crunch. No, we're not. Okay. And so I think that that's one thing that I'd really like to emphasize, is that a lot of the small media organizations don't have the same kind of privilege. And I'll just give you one quick example of this. San Diego City Beat is this great little online publication in San Diego, California. And they use Facebook a lot. They rely on it. They check their analytics. They've relied on it for a long time to get their content out. And of course, they've seen a shift after the latest changes to the algorithms, but that's not what this story is about. Around Christmas of last year, they had published an article in the wake of all of the Me Too conversations in the US around sexual harassment. And the article had the title, "Dear Men, You're All Trash," something like that. Okay, a little provocative, maybe a little offensive, but I don't think that most courts, most people would call that hate speech. Well, Facebook did call that hate speech, and they banned that URL from being posted anywhere on their platform. And so this really popular columnist for the San Diego City Beat found herself suddenly censored by a major platform. And I can guarantee you that that wouldn't have happened if it were BuzzFeed. In fact, I know that it wouldn't have happened because BuzzFeed's published really similar URLs before and not had the same experience. So that's where I'm coming from, and I think that the one last thing I'll say is just in my job as an NGO, I often have to be the intermediary between small media or activists or individuals and these platforms. And I think my big ethical question comes in there, because ultimately what I'm doing is performing free labor for these companies that can afford to do all of this. So.
Cool. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to ask a question, and you guys we've known each other for long enough that you guys can feel free to jump in and interrupt each other. We're going to run this like a living room conversation, if that's cool with everyone. All right. So first, I want to pick up on something that that Dina said about constantly ethical questions are something that is constantly that are constantly to be considered in newsrooms and by people who run the social platforms. What I want to ask you is, how often are your bosses thinking about it? You know, when your bosses demand the numbers, or when they want to see the numbers and how well they're doing or how poorly they're doing on social, how often are they asking you, how are you going around about getting this data, and what responsibility do we have? Jump in, anyone.
Yeah, I think I can start. At Al Jazeera, at least, it never came up, and I would be surprised if it came up with anyone, because the issue hadn't really been brought to the forefront until quite recently. You know, it took Cambridge Analytica to get people to really think about it and look back. Ryan?
I would say that we, in terms of my bosses, it's it's very hard to speak for Marty Barron. So let's be honest here. I will say that we do have regular conversations around ethics. Social media, specifically with the platforms, I would say that it's somewhat less regular, but you know, definitely we have had conversations that include, you know, do we have a problem with, you know, with this X, you know, set of circumstances? I generally think we know where each other stands, but you know, in a newsroom where we're making, you know, where the news is crushing us every single day, I would not say that is the #1 topic at all times.
Right. Dina?
I mean, I think it depends what you're doing with analytics. If you have a cookie on your website that you're tracking users wherever they are, so if they, you know, I'm not even sure if this is possible, but, you know, so say you're just following them around the web, that's deeply unethical. But if you are, you know, tracking which page a user goes to on your website, and then, you know, using that data to make real-time decisions to inform their behavior and give them a better experience, you know, this is obviously a normative judgment on my part, but I would say that there's nothing unethical about wanting the people that visit your website to have the best experience, and there's nothing unethical about using like data that Facebook can provide you. And for those who haven't kind of had quite a lot of experience with the data that Facebook provides you, if you run a big page, they don't. They will say how many people reached your post. They can give you a kind of estimate about how many people clicked a link on your post, but if you have good analytics on a user's end, and most websites will, you don't really need that. And they will allow you to kind of segment, they can allow you to target very broad groups with your post. And that's pretty much it. And I mean, I personally think that is completely fine and ethical, but I would be very interested to hear if anyone in the audience thought that was presenting some kind of ethics issue.
Jillian, do you want?
I mean, I can just sort of jump in and say, from my perspective, you know, the organization I work for gets comments from our fans or members, you know, telling us that it's unethical for us to even post on Facebook. So I'm coming from a very different world. But, you know, I mean, I think that from our perspective as an NGO that's working on digital rights, we, of course, I would love to just say everyone leave Facebook. I've argued actually against that point on the grounds that that's not feasible for so many people. It's not feasible for me even, for reasons that I won't get into. You can read them, I've written about them. But I think that, yeah, I mean, for me, the most ethical thing to do is to work and educate readers or our users or Facebook users about what they're getting themselves into and how to ameliorate the potential privacy risks.
See, I was coming at it from the perspective of, you know, there's been so much pressure on digital teams to deliver over the last few years, and there has been a real dearth of digital literacy in senior management and people who sort of set out policies and guidelines at media organizations about how data is to be collected and how it's to be used. And because there's been such a run for numbers and there's been such a dearth of literacy, I was just wondering if it was across the board or just, you know, in certain cases. All right, well, you know, now that news organizations have this reference point of Cambridge Analytica and about how data is collected with or without people's consent, would you say that you, as a publisher, Ryan, you're the Washington Post, how does that affect how you go about collecting audience data and what you're doing with it, with the new knowledge that you guys have?
Well, first of all, I would say change is slow. So, I think the conversations have to, like Dina was saying, I think the conversations are ongoing, and, it's very hard to make a decision, even if you, rigorously discuss it and say, okay, here, we're going to take an hour and we're going to have a rigorous discussion about something, and to say, okay, here, we have the answer of how to handle this every single time, and we're not going to think about any exceptions in any particular way. I will say that there are certain levers in the newsroom, in the organization, that can help sort of stir some of these conversations. So maybe that's actually the place to start in this particular case. So, even as a U.S. company, we are, thinking about and talking about GDPR. Okay, there you go. You have to, our website is serviceable in Europe, and therefore, we have to look at that. And so, the instigators of that conversation in our organization, are both senior management, but also our legal team. And so, in terms of starting conversations, I think that's not a bad one. Okay, you can start there. I also think you can start by thinking about, in my particular organization, subscriptions. So, a lot of the language around this is, where actually is all this data, right? If you're kind of out there and you're like, all right, well, the news organization's collecting some data, on their own, where is it, right? Who are the organization? What parts of the organization? In my case, the Washington Post is quite large. Where does that sit? And so some of that is on an analytics team. Some sort of analytics or metrics team, and I think that's also an interesting place. Now, traditionally, analytics teams, in my experience at least, in sort of talking with various publishers, are supposed to be a very neutral party, right? We collect the data. All of you can kind of interpret and figure that out, but in an organization, they say, oh, we're the keepers of keeping the data clean, right? But I would argue that that part of the organization also has a responsibility to sort of say, okay, but we actually know the nitty-gritty of what we're collecting, right? What is the difference between a page view and a unique visitor? What is how do we count page views? When does this sort of action fire? Those are the kinds of things that you need to know the details in order to have a good conversation about something. The third is marketing. So, if it's not legal, if it's not the analytics team, I think the marketing team, has the ability to have that conversation and bring something to the table if you're going to have a rigorous discussion about this kind of thing, because they are the ones that oftentimes are using some of that data to then go acquire new users or retain certain users. And I think that piece of that, the Washington Post is a subscription organization, so we use it particularly in the subscriber world. But also, I think there's a lot of different ways. Certain organizations, the marketing team is primarily an advertising function, and so similarly, I would argue that there's room in an organization, in a department like that, to also bring something to the table. And the last thing I would say is, you should have those conversations within your department, but also, bring it to a larger part of your organization. Have that with multiple teams, because if you're having that conversation in a vacuum, you don't know what the business implications are. You don't know what the strategy implications are. And if you're not hashing it out at a slightly lower level, then it's hard to recommend anything to your executives. This is kind of, overall, it's for any process, I think it's very hard I'm of the mind that you can't sort of do that alone and say, the newsroom wants this and it must be this way, and here's my argument. It's like, go hash it out with everybody else first, so you at least know where they stand, and then you could say, the newsroom wants this, but, marketing is opposed to it, and here's why.
Dina, you want to add something?
I think the Cambridge Analytica scandal is quite interesting when you talk about it in terms of what it means for our data, because obviously it's not good if your data is being used for something that you didn't consent to it being used for. But at the heart of the kind of things that people are getting really truly angry about is the idea that advertising might be targeted to them, which is something that has been basically going on since advertising was invented, and it's just gotten more and more and more sophisticated. And obviously, I think that GDPR and those are kind of wide-ranging privacy new rules coming in about what you can do with data from the EU. For those that aren't aware of it, I think that that's actually very helpful in terms of individual data. And I know Mark Zuckerberg has said that Facebook is going to roll it out kind of worldwide, and I think that more and more companies will probably end up. I think that will become the kind of data privacy standard worldwide, which is a really good thing. But I don't think fundamentally there's a problem with targeted advertising, and I think we kind of need to be careful about where our outrage goes. Also, I think it's just very easy to be angry with Facebook, because I don't think that they've been very successful at kind of explaining why they're such a good thing. I mean, I fundamentally think that Facebook has helped thousands of people connect. It's given my dad something to do. It's a really, it's actually quite a useful platform. And I've had several conversations and connections via it that it's just never happened before. But I don't think that they've ever focused on kind of telling that story about themselves. And I think that that's why no one remembers it, when they're just kind of angry at them.
Yeah. If I may follow up on your point about targeted advertising, we use it all the time at Al Jazeera. Everyone uses it. It's super helpful, I agree. But I think there's a big difference between targeting people based on characteristics that they have, freely given a tech company, and characteristics that have been inferred about them or collected about them without their informed consent. So, I am a proponent
That's what I was about to say, because, I spent more time in television than in digital, and I know that the data that's collected about TV watchers is absolutely 100% with consent, Nielsen and whatnot, when they collect data, and everybody knows what that data is going to be used for, and it's limited, and the uses are quite limited in scope. But, what I was wondering is, when you do paid promos and when you do targeted advertising, a lot of the data that you have, especially the granular stuff, is inferred from all kinds of data points. So go ahead, carry on.
Yeah, so I wrote recently about a term I coined called ethical ad targeting, which is where we should learn to accept that our ads are going to be slightly less efficient for the sake of preserving people's privacy. So instead of targeting, for example, people who are Hispanic and liberal in a certain city, they've told Facebook or Google or whoever where they live, but they haven't given them any info on their race or their political orientation. That's been inferred. Instead of targeting based on those characteristics, you would target them based on other things that they had given, such as accounts that they actually follow. You have actually made the choice to give Facebook that information. So yeah, that's my position on it. Maybe it's bogus.
No, I actually completely agree. And I feel like I'm almost a little out of my element here, but I think that, Facebook in particular has long tried to get away with as much as possible. They don't have any practices around consent when it comes down to it. You consent once to the terms of service when you sign up. You never consent again. There are changes frequently. I mean, we all know this. I think this is pretty common knowledge in a room like this. But yeah, I absolutely agree with what you said. I think that there's a lot of ways that these companies could do this. And I don't know, has anyone ever gone to into their Facebook settings and looked at what the company actually does infer about you? Is it accurate for anyone?
I think this is everybody's been doing it over the last 2 weeks.
There was another round of media like about a year ago where it came up again too, and most of the companies think I'm a man, which I absolutely love. It's great. I'm like, this is because of my political view, because I'm political? I don't even know. Great, way to be sexist, companies. Sexist algorithms, but yeah, they they're not getting it really right a lot of the time, which is not good for the companies who are doing the advertising in the first place. I mean, companies want to actually target people who are going to buy their products. I think we all know that too. But then, yeah, I do think that there's an ethical question here around the issue of consent, and I have no problem with, I follow most of those funny accounts on Twitter, like the food ones, moon pies and Pop-Tarts and all the ones that are hilarious. I would have no problem if American Foods just all started targeting me right now. That'd be great. I'm not going to buy them. I don't live there, but yeah, I think that's really what it comes down to.
But here's the thing, right? I mean, there's all this data that is inferable, that's gettable, that is so far quite useful to companies like, Al Jazeera, Washington Post, The Independent. It's almost like the ring for Frodo, right? It's great to put it on, and things happen when you put it on. I guess my question is, are social media companies just filling a gap that traditional media just never filled? They never got into the business of gathering data, inferring data about their audience, keeping the data safe, going about it the right way. Are social media companies basically providing something that these guys never got around to getting?
Or are these advertising companies that are just providing a social service?
Well, yeah. I mean, I would argue, like Experian or any other, big data aggregator out there, they're technically not social companies. They're in fact sucking in, social data and a variety of other data around, your grocery store purchases, your, what else? Gas stations, anywhere. Credit card data is very valuable as well out there on the market, and so I would say that. In some ways, no, I think is the answer. Like, I think the idea that, that journalism, that publishers are, would they be the ones to step in instead of a social media company? They just missed the boat on this, I would say, I don't think so. I think there are plenty of other companies out there, that are going to find ways to violate your privacy in all kinds of different, in all kinds of different ways. And it's social media platforms in particular, I think, have, specific challenges because of the sort of veneer, at least, of sort of controls, right? Which is sort of what you were talking about. But, the idea that, if you really think that if you get off social media, you are not being tracked, I think you've got it coming to you. There's a lot of other ways people get data, and I think that this gets back to, I mean, the big scary one that people freaked out about, right? Like every 6 months or so, there's some major blow up or some story that goes viral that says, here's how you're being tracked. The big one was Target many years ago. The big, I guess I don't know how worldwide Target is, but the idea that major sort of superstore was sending mailer promos to women they thought were pregnant, and they inferred that information. And so oftentimes, if you are a woman and you have not told your family and you live at your address, and you have not told your family that you are pregnant, and you start getting ads, then that puts you in a very weird position, right? And I think the idea that there's very few ways out of this as we started this conversation, but I don't think this is actually specific to publishers.
I just love the idea of thinking what you would have to do to avoid being tracked. So I was just having to think about it now. I think you have to use Tor, which is the dark web browser, get paid entirely in cash, and just avoid all CCTV. How do you go off the grid?
And if you want to use email, you have to get a balaclava and some rubber gloves, go buy a money order. It's really complicated. Burner phone.
Only use Starbucks public Wi-Fi if you ever want to send an email while on tour.
So I guess then that means data collection is as much a fact of life as debt or disease or just death.
Yeah. Taxes.
Yeah, it's inevitable.
That would just need to be managed. That's the sense I'm getting here. So what part of the equation do media organizations that during the daytime report on this massive breaches of privacy and inappropriate collection of data, while at the same time crave that data to run their paid promos and whatnot? What responsibility do media companies have then? Where's their space? Where's their spot?
Well, I think we do have a very privileged position with these technology companies. Most people don't have access to them. Everyone at this table and a lot of people in the audience that work in media, we have contacts at Facebook or Twitter or Google or Snapchat or so on. And I do think we have a responsibility to say, hey, this is great, but we're concerned about this. Or, you don't have to go this far because we would like to uphold these principles. So I do think there is something we could do, and if we weren't asking for so much, these companies wouldn't be developing so much.
Well, I mean, when I first started, and I don't work at the Independent anymore, I can't speak for them, and they never asked for this data. But when I first started, I was like to our liaison partner at Facebook, I said like, oh, can I have as much as possible? Can I find out what they like? Can I find out like, you know, what the other pages that people who like my page like, and you know, sort of everything that I possibly can about them. I just want to know, and I also want to know the people who like the big independent page, if they also like our sub pages. And Facebook were just like, no, you cannot have that data. We do not allow people to have that data. And you know, and I think that, you know, people don't talk about the times that Facebook said no to them, and like actually Facebook probably had these conversations probably before journalists were having these conversations with themselves, because they were more aware of the huge machine that they were building.
Jillian, what would be a media company's responsibility to advocate, to protect, to look at Well, what would be, I just said, what would be a media company's space then? Responsibility to advocate, to protect, to look the other way? What's from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I was on a panel yesterday where it was noted that over the past 10 years or so, it's gone from the media being really excited and just fawning over these companies to going completely 180 and now, you know, just shitting all over them. Sorry to use an impolite term. I think that the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, because all of this ragging on these companies hasn't really given users or readers much in terms of information and actionable items. And so I think that the media's job here is to challenge the companies, but also to work with whomever, whether it's researchers, academics, NGOs, to help educate the populace. I mean, there are some media companies that are doing this well, and then there are plenty that are really not doing this at all, and they're just kind of complaining. And so I would really, really like to see the media step up on this and help make sure that their readers and users of these platforms understand what they're getting themselves into and what they can do about it.
Yeah, do you think the media has done a poor job of explaining social media, data collection by social media companies to its audiences?
I wouldn't want to generalize there. There are certain companies that do an excellent job. The Guardian does a great job. The New York Times does a great job. The Washington Post does a great job. Can I rely on, you know, Como 15, you know, local news broadcaster to inform me about data collection at Facebook or Twitter? Probably not, but I think the big organizations on the reporting side have done a good job. But I'm more interested in the non-reporters.
Right. Yeah. Do you think there is scope for collective action from media organizations or journalists to, you know, push for change? Because you already have an established relationship with the social media organizations, right? Or is that just too pie in the sky? I see you.
I'm just smiling because I'm just imagining people in the British media working together from rival newspapers. It's like, yeah, no. I think that I would very much like that to happen. We used to all, I think that all social media editors kind of, I'm not sure if this is the same in America, but we all talk to each other. And it's a little bit like sports journalism or political journalism, where you kind of you're all in the trenches together. But organisationally, there's such a deep, entrenched rivalry in Britain between the different papers. I can't imagine any kind of, and I don't think that any action to sort of target Facebook will work if it's just one publisher. But it would be interesting. Do you think America would do it? Or do you do it?
I mean, I think that we certainly talk to other organizations, you know, on occasion. I wouldn't say we have quite the closeness of a regular meeting, but I actually think that we need to do more on the storytelling side as well. I think this is not as much as you can, you know, put up a nice graphic that shows how data collection works and all that other stuff. This is a topic that actually needs to be explained again and again and again, and needs to be done in new ways, and there needs to be investigative work into sort of because not all trackers are built alike, and not all, I mean, we're a little bit generalizing here today, to be fair. Yeah. You know, we can get into sort of email tracking versus, you know, web tracking versus your credit cards versus your whatever. Right. And I think that there's more explanatory journalism to be done in this space. And I think there's some organizations out there that have done a nice job explaining what that is, either using sort of a personal narrative, right? You take one person's journey and you open up their phone and you download, or you open up their Facebook page and you download their data and they say, oh, here's what I found in my data. I think that's very compelling. But I think that we have not done a particularly good job about sort of talking about the ecosystem, right? We can talk about one specific platform and how relevant it is to you. I think coverage-wise, you could say, oh, here's one isolated example. Here are bad actors. But sort of zooming out is pretty difficult to do in explanatory work. And I think that on the reporting side, we always can do more, including the Washington Post and others. And we at least endeavor to continue that process.
No, Russ, do you want to add something to that, Jillian? No, one more point I wanted to make was, this is sort of like a full circle thing that you just said, right? Sorry. This is sort of like a full circle thing that you just said, right? The journalists who report on this and who will do the explaining to the audiences are also stakeholders they're also users of social media. I wonder, and I'm talking about this from personal experience, I wonder about their degree of literacy of how this thing works. Because a sports journalist will know their field, their beat inside out. A tech journalist will know their beat inside out. These are all very specialized, but not everybody watches sports, and not everybody is into tech, but everybody uses social media. But the literacy, at least speaking from personal experience, is abysmal about how this thing actually works. And at the same time, there is the responsibility to explain to your audiences how this thing works. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I was just remembering the Senate hearings. Sorry, I was laughing because
Sorry, can I interrupt? It felt like how digital teams talk to their higher-ups every day. That was the conversation that happened between Mark Zuckerberg and the congressional hearing. It took me back to my conversations with my senior managers at times. That whole thing about how do you make money? Well, we sell ads, Senator. That was a moment I thought, aha, I've said this before. I've said this before to somebody in a suit.
Yeah, I mean, I was sitting there going like, okay, not only do these senators have no idea what they're talking about, but I could answer some of the questions better than Mark Zuckerberg could, and that really scared me. No, I'm not sure that I have a whole lot to add on this one, because I think that, yeah, I mean, not being from inside of a newsroom, it's harder to... But as an observer, I'm going to pass.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there are several, and I think you brought up a good point about continuing to do more journalism on this issue, because there are several layers to it. There is, the way our marketing departments work. There is the way that we, involved with audience growth, want to use data to our audiences. There is, the way that we write articles in a way that, anyone can read them. A lot of the coverage is quite technical and quite heavy, and those people are going to read our stories anyway. But we need everyone to be aware of these issues, and how do we communicate that in a way that is engaging? Yeah.
I'm going to open it up to questions. Anybody from the audience? Right up here in the front. We'll go with this side first, and then we'll go over there. So this lady here? Oh, okay. Whichever. Fight.
Hello, thank you. I'm Claudio, privacy analyst. I wonder if in your newsroom there is some policy about taking content from social media such as YouTube or Facebook, user-generated content, and republish them in your pages. Because this in Italy happen a lot, especially normally for victims, like, look, this young family now destroyed. And we understand that it's an ethical issue.
Are they always that happy when they say that?
Well, increase engagement.
Okay.
I actually have an interesting example for you there. In America, I know that they're a lot more rigorous when it comes to verifying UGC and getting clearance to use it, because copyright laws are quite strong and quite voraciously litigated against. But when I was talking to certain journalists in the Arab world, they said, there's a great video on YouTube, we should publish it. I go, did they tell you you can? They go, no, They go, do you know, has anyone verified it? They go, no. They go, but it's on YouTube. We can use it. It's on the internet. So I think there's absolutely a knowledge gap on the journalist side about what is copyright and what is ethical verification of footage that just comes to them.
Yeah, I would just add to that and say, though, that I don't think U.S. papers have any sort of ethics when it comes to quoting tweets. I mean, I'm sorry, like, this has happened to me 100 times from the Post, the New York Times, famously. Google Jillian J. Yikes, you'll see a great story. Yeah, no, I mean, this happens to me constantly, and I don't see any ethics around it. I know, I understand YouTube.
Just on a content level, on a copyright level.
On a copyright level, yeah. But I don't know if it was a copyright question or a violation of privacy question. And I think that, I think, again, we could come back to the Me Too stories from last fall. And I know a lot of women whose tweets that they expected to be for a small audience were taken and amplified by major papers with no ethical considerations whatsoever. So I'm actually surprised and pleased when a journalist contacts me, in DM and says, hey, is it okay if I quote your tweet? I mean, my answer is almost always yes, but it's like, oh, you asked. That's so nice.
But I mean, I suppose as well, that's a problem with literacy of Twitter users, because any journalist will say, and I actually personally disagree, because I think that you're right. I think it's really difficult for people whose tweets go viral and they get embedded. But any journalist will say, well, you've said that on a public platform, so I'm completely entitled to embed you. And actually, I mean, they can, you can't, I don't think you could sue them in any country for doing that. However, I think most people who write their tweets don't really understand that, this is the thing, and that's another sort of issue. And I don't think it's in reporters' interest to really educate their readers on that.
No, and I would also just say, in response to that quickly, that I mean, I agree there's no legal consideration or concern there, but ethically, it's almost like quoting the person that you heard at the next table at lunch, and I don't know of any journalist who would do that, and so well, okay, maybe.
And then Link can be like, and you can attack her here.
But I mean, I don't think we've ever had like a national or international conversation about the ethics of that, and I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I try to teach other journalists to avoid is to like string together 4 or 5 reactions, and this is, so if you actually look at what are the posts that are being published in this manner, right, a lot of them are reaction posts, and the title of the headline on those posts are, "The Internet Thinks Blank."
Right.
And so there is a blanket ban on that type of headline. Right. If I find one, I will come find the journalist in my newsroom that has written that, because it's really irresponsible. The internet thinks something. There's no such thing, right? The internet cannot think something, right? There are certain individuals that are sort of representing a couple of voices, and you can't string together 5 tweets and embed it in an article and say, okay, that's my story, right? Like that's the irresponsible part in my opinion. Where I think embedding without asking is useful, right, is from official sources, from places that are using it as a channel to distribute information.
That's what I was about to get to, right?
I think is a very different
because ever since the Syrian war happened, the only way for a lot of Syrians on the ground to share material was through YouTube. They would upload it to YouTube. And there was this understanding that anybody could just pluck it and use it. Yes, there was lots of bad actors, lots of shady characters, but at Al Jazeera, for example, my team had developed relationships with 2 or 3 people who we knew were good actors, and that was the only way they could get video out. If there was and the understanding right at the beginning was, well, we're going to upload stuff. We're going to upload stuff from protests. We're going to upload stuff from whatever, and you guys are free to use them. But I think in the Middle East that got a bit out of hand, where people started doing that, and then eventually anything that was on YouTube became fair game, especially during the Arab Spring, where people just started downloading other people's work. And then something that happened in Libya would end up happening would end up being attributed to Syria. I remember there was one case where somebody sent me a video of a plane flying overhead and somebody shooting it down, and the plane crashing in a big ball of fire, and there was lots of shouts of Allahu Akbar, and they were like, well, this is in Syria, run it. And I had to look up and freeze frame the plane and say, no, they don't fly MiG-21s in Syria. Sorry, this is in Libya. I was like, no, they don't fly MiG-21s in Libya. They fly MiG-21s in Syria. This is not, this is not a correct video. But yeah, we have a bit of a Wild West situation in places like the Middle East, and I would imagine in many other smaller markets where, you know, copyright laws and litigation is not sort of the order of the day. Next question.
Thanks. Courtney, I work for the Committee to Protect Journalists, but also as a journalist for your competitors, Al Arabiya, and for the New York Times. And I think there's actually, you know, if you're in a public, this happened, I can't remember if it was the Post or the New York Times, but they were sitting at the Palm restaurant and overheard two officials talking about something and published it. So I don't think that there's a perfect analogy there. But what I wanted to ask you about in terms, two questions. One, you're saying that you mentioned that you want to know your readers well so you can give them more of, you know, what they're interested in. But yesterday or 2 days ago, Maria Ressa from the Rappler in the Philippines said, you know, as a news editor, part of my role is to give the news, not just give you what you want. So I'd like your reaction to that. And then second of all, to the issue of reporting better on these issues, I've seen very little reporting in the broader Cambridge Analytica reporting about the fact that Facebook had people embedded with the campaigns to help them use things better. And I would like to know why we think that is, because that seems to be a critical part of the story. It's not just like, oh my God, this data was used. I can't believe it.
Who wants to take that first?
If I can address your first question, there's definitely a balance that needs to be struck between the stories that we want to tell that are editorially important and the stories that people will actually read or watch. So when I joined Al Jazeera, they were very much of the opinion that we know what the audience wants, we know more than them, and we will give them that to them. But as a result, they weren't getting viewed. So it's nice for us to say it's our job as journalists to only tell the most important things. But if you're not, you know, conscious of your actual readers, they're not going to stick around because they can only take so many, you know, murders and bombings and, you know, corruption discussions. They need some other stuff that they actually care about to keep them engaged.
But I think it can be a false dichotomy. I think if
Yeah.
you really understand if you really understand kind of, if you look at what's going viral over on a site over a few years and you kind of really understand why that might be and what people are interested in, you can use that information to make the stories that, you know, some people would consider the most journalistically important to reach a wider audience. And that's definitely something that we had like a lot of fun doing. And I mean, like, I imagine the Washington Post has the same thing, that they're most like the biggest investigative stories are you know, the most popular, and I certainly found that.
Yeah, same on that topic. I would say that we talk about how to make I believe the Jeff Bezos quote is you need to make the important interesting for people. And if you're not doing that, you're not really doing your job. I mean, that's not the Jeff Bezos. I've misquoted him already. But I think the idea, right, is that you know, the important stuff should be the most interesting and should be the most read, and often is in our newsroom. You know, between investigations and, you know, Donald Trump, you know, not necessarily every last tweet, but particularly, you know, deep work that analyzes what his dealings were in the past, I think are some of our most read work over time. In terms of your second question, because I don't want to let that go entirely, you know, I think a lot of us would be speculating up here. I mean, I will tell you that, you know, there are people from, you know, when I have been to a Democratic or a Republican convention, you know, honestly, like Facebook, Twitter, a lot of these companies are kind of everywhere, and they are there for the full time, both publicly and, you know, and privately for in all capacities, right? They've got PR people, they've got comms people, they've got, you know, people working directly with news organizations. They've got people who are working with the campaigns. I don't actually, I'm not surprised by, you know, when I hear that, because my assumption is that is happening a lot and happening, you know, universally and happening for both parties.
Universally in the US, but not universally globally, and I think that's actually the really interesting part of it. I mean, I won't name the example, but you know the example that I give in other talks often of the country where they don't do any political advertising because they have to ban one party, right? And so...
No, I want to hear it.
It's Lebanon.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I just didn't want to tell the whole story. I just knew she already knew it. It's fine. But that's actually happening increasingly in other places as groups get added to terrorist watch lists and whatnot. And so, you know, in the US, you can say, okay, well, we're just embedding in these places and it's seen as completely normal. And then in other countries, you have either the exact opposite, where they're not doing anything to engage, which is my preferred stance, to be fair, or where they're actually potentially meddling in foreign elections.
Like Duterte.
Yeah, that's a really good example, yeah. And so, he said Duterte in case you didn't hear on the mic. And so, yeah, I mean, I do think that, I think it's troubling that it's not surprising, I guess. And I think that that's another thing where, like, we've just societally kind of come to accept that without really asking what that means, not just for the United States, but for the rest of the world.
Hiya, I'm Jasmine. I used to work with Yasser and Ziad. They're actually my former bosses, to be honest. But I've got a...
We planted her.
And this is not planned. So I have a little question. So with the algorithms changing, us as a news organization, we have to spend money on advertising and actually put money on certain articles or posts or videos that we push out there. And I have found myself in a bit of a dilemma when I see videos or articles on, I don't know, you name it, starving children in Yemen appearing as a sponsored post. And in my head I'm thinking, is that just a way of, if one were to like compare it to, hey, I'm gonna print more magazines in that town and put more money there because I know people are more interested there? Or is it actually an issue that we have to think about a little bit more of it being unethical in a certain way?
I think that's a really great question. And, you know, at Al Jazeera, we did try and think about the way that sponsored posts were perceived. And I don't want to say that there was a hard and fast rule, but we did think about that, and I'm not sure what the answer is there. Like, yeah, like what posts should be promoted? Because I completely agree with you that, you know, if it's a bombing and a chemical attack in Syria, it looks bad as a news organization that you're saying, hey, we've paid money to get more traffic on our coverage of suffering.
But yeah, is it bad to bring attention to a chemical attack? I mean, every single thing that you do, like as journalists, is about an assumption and what people will be interested in. When you cover one story, you don't cover another story. Oh, sorry. When you cover one story, you don't cover another story, and every single thing you do as a journalist is you know, about making a decision like that. So, I mean, it probably is problematic, but no more problematic than any other decision that you make as a news editor in particular.
Ryan? I tend to agree with Dina on this one because, you know, my thinking has always been, yes, it's money, yes, it's there, yes, we have the audience data, yes, we know where to get it, and yes, we know how to distribute this. This is a really important story. Yes, people have died, but, you know, we don't advertise to celebrate or to you know, we don't advertise or pay for advertising only to be whorish about it, right? You know, it's to get the thing to as many people as possible. So I've always been pro sponsoring posts, just so we could expand the audience to the degree that we can expand it. Next, this lady here, please.
Thank you. I wondered what you, because somebody made that point about promoting content, you know, so that editors, oh, my name is Eliza, I used to work at The Guardian full-time, so I have some perspective on this. You know, that journalists will make better decisions if we collect as much data as possible, whereas actually, ultimately, we are collecting data for advertising, right? It's about that business model. So I wonder if there are more changes to the business model. How do you think more membership-based platforms might change our relationship to social networks, and will that have a sort of domino effects even for legacy newsrooms?
I'll let Ryan first and Dina next take this one.
I mean, again, it's a little bit of speculation here because you know a lot of this is part of the natural conversation that will have to happen over time. You know, the idea. I would argue that yes, we do have to come to terms with the fact that you know we may have started to collect data for advertising reasons, and now we have to collect data for subscription reasons. So I think just business model wise, if you're a smart company, you are asking that question and saying, okay, what are the things that we actually, what are the variables, what are the types of data that we want to collect, and why does it matter, and how does that sort of, you know, basically sort of come up to the goal of whatever business you're trying to engage in. Now, the reality, if many of you have been to the revenue panels at this place, is that most likely there's going to be a mix of revenue models, right? And so, you know, I wouldn't argue that there's, you know, it'd be very hard to convince me that there's sort of a one-day change where you can say, okay, like we're going to switch off this type of data collection, and we're going to turn on this type of data collection. At the moment, you know, again, getting back to sort of who in the company is actually doing the data collection, this is why we have to engage all parts of the company in that discussion. The analytics team would be able to tell you and say, okay, well, we collect this for advertising, but we collect this for the newsroom, and we collect this, and some of them are shared and some of them are not. And one of the things we're doing in the Washington Post newsroom is trying to align some of those metrics much more closely, so that we're all saying, okay, the number one thing we're looking at is this type of metric, and that applies across advertising, it applies across the newsroom, it applies across our subscription business. And that's the kind of discussion that's required to sort of think about, all right, well then, you know, from there, everything kind of trickles down. And so, you know, in terms of the actual social media networks, I don't know. I think the Post is maybe a little bit unique. I guess it's not unique, but I would say we may be a little bit more conservative in this way. We generally speaking are not running, for instance, the types of Facebook ads that try to like cross-pollinate essentially. So you know, by using sort of basically trying to advertise on Facebook, you have to be careful about how you say these things because the details matter, and but we're not trying to advertise on Facebook on behalf of one of our advertisers. So, but like for many companies out there, that's very common, right? So, you know, they're all the nuances of that, and kind of breaking it apart and getting specific about the language is important. You know, the way we do that instead is if we're going to advertise on Facebook, for instance, for one of our advertisers, what we're going to do instead is we're going to say that's a separate part of the company, right? That's a brand studio is what we would call that. And so then we would say we're going to create the creative for that, and we're going to run that advertisement because it links to our brand studio site. So we are sort of closed. We're running a closed loop as opposed to advertising for another advertiser. And so it's like a little bit of inception there because you have to have levels and levels of understanding. But that's the kind of thing that you have to have a real discussion about. And you know, what are the types of advertising you're going to actually offer in the market?
Oh, just really quickly, I don't think that websites, well, I mean, I don't think they started collecting data for advertising. I think, you know, there's several reasons why a website might collect data, like on page views, things like audited circulation, online circulations, which we have, as you know, in the UK, but also I don't think that advertising and funding journalism is like a dirty word. I know that lots of people are like, oh, that's for advertising. Advertising is the thing that if you're a journalist, is the thing helping you keep afloat and helping you do those great investigations and helping, you know, you get paid more. And I think that it's something that while we shouldn't be influenced by in terms of what we do editorially, it's definitely something that we should be aware of and not embrace, but just understand the kind of factors that are going on there, and you know where the money comes from and where the revenue comes from, and you know how to get more behind your team.
I have time for one more question. Oh, great, we've answered all your questions. You guys want to say something to close off?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I just wanted to say thank you to all my panelists here. No.
We need closing arguments, yeah.
I think it's really important that we actually have these discussions, and I don't think we 5 years ago, we were talking about what are the ethics of targeting these ads on Facebook, and it's great that we all can come here and talk about it and think about these things, and we all seem to have very different perspectives on it, so yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, and thank you guys for coming.
Thank you, guys.
No, I was going to say, and yes, and now
Dina?
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
No, it's my...
Sir?